My title is Professional Education versus General Education. In what sense is the value of knowledge intrinsic? Various forms of traditional academic elitism excluded professional education, including medicine, engineering, and law, from the academic curriculum, on grounds of the intrinsic, that is to say, non-instrumental value of university education and scholarship. In this paper or presentation, I shall explore arguments from John Stuart Mill, Cardinal John Newman, and Immanuel Kant to this effect, attempting to clarify what non-instrumental value they find in university education and scholarship, and why it should serve to exclude the professional and sometimes the scientific and the technological, or what is sometimes now called techno-scientific. In Kant's case, I shall point out more integrative options implicit in his approach. I shall then look at some contemporary resolutions of these issues by Philip Kitcher, Jacques Derrida, and Jürgen Habermas. I don't know if I can do all of it, but I'll try. The question I wish to address is the following. What does it mean to say that knowledge, academic or otherwise, is its own end, studied for its own sake, as you phrase it, or that it is to be pursued for its own sake? What is it that underlies the empty-sounding formula, knowledge for the sake of knowledge? And how does it relate to more substantive evaluations of the normative place of knowledge, namely the kinds of freedom and the questions of justice associated with its pursuit? I raise this question not because I share the anti-professional elitism of some of these authors that I mentioned, but because contemporary academic markets have tilted in the opposite direction, almost fully measuring university education and research in economic terms, leaving academics to wonder what else is there to the value of academic work that can serve to constrain industrial tendencies in the production of knowledge, and how might an integrative view of the academic ethos be defended, incorporating the rational, the functional, and the socially critical in a single vision. I perhaps should add, if I have a thesis to this paper, is that the unity required, in my view, for this integrative view of academic research and teaching is not unity of content, as was suggested earlier, and not unity of method, but a very different unity that was not yet mentioned in our discussions today, and that is the unity of free inquiry. Free inquiry and its truth-approaching tendencies. To some of this I'll come along the way. Well, in 1867, John Stuart Mill delivered an inaugural address to the University of St. Andrews. In that address, he expressed his views regarding the educational mission of national, that is to say public universities, and I quote, "The proper function of a university in national education is tolerably well understood. At least there is a tolerably general agreement about what a university is not. It is not a place of professional education. Universities are not intended to teach the knowledge required to fit men." Mill was a feminist, but I guess 150 years later, I should still apologize for this gender bias, and I apologize. So the knowledge required to fit men for some special mode of gaining their livelihood. Their object is not to make skillful lawyers or physicians or engineers, but capable and cultivated human beings. In this highly elitist, and one should say class-privileged view, the mission of a national university is to bring the light of general culture to the minds of the students, not the training of professional experts in such disciplines as law, medicine, or engineering. Mill's exclusion of professional knowledge is made in terms of a contrast, indeed a dichotomy, between professional training and cultural cultivation, as if the one excludes the other. The latter of these being the sole mission of university education because in some way it constitutes its own reward, whereas professional training is economically motivated. I move now to Cardinal Newman and the idea of a university. A similar emphasis on the intellectual and the universal, as well as on teaching, is found in Cardinal John Newman's preface of 1852 to the Discourses and lectures entitled The Idea of a University. And I quote, "The view taken of the university in these discourses is the following, that it is a place of teaching universal knowledge. This implies that its object is, on the one hand, intellectual, not moral," and by this he meant ecclesiastical, church-oriented, "and on the other, that it is the diffusion and extension of knowledge rather than the advancement. If its object were scientific and philosophical discovery," says Newman, "I do not see why a university should have students," a sentiment that some of us may share. "If religious training, I do not see how it can be the seat of literature and science." As can be seen, Newman's exclusions are even broader than Mill's and include both scientific research and moral education, the former being the province of isolated geniuses like Newton, the latter the exclusive domain of the church. The explicit exclusion of professional education comes in Newman's 7th discourse, where Locke is confronted as the advocate of utility in education. Newman rails against the view that, and I quote, "education should be confined to some particular and narrow end, and should issue in some definite work, which can be weighed and measured." He goes on to defend liberal education against the utilitarian critique. The critique was that it does not teach us how to advance our manufactures, or to improve our lands, or to better our civil economy, or again, it does not at once make this man, again, the gender bias, a lawyer, that an engineer, and that a surgeon. Or at least, it does not lead to discoveries in chemistry, astronomy, geology, magnetism, and science of every kind. So this was the critique, and of course Newman was arguing against it. Both Mill and Newman articulate the value of academic education in terms of a distinction between inherent and instrumental value. I quote from Mill, "But there is one reward which will not fail you." He is addressing the students of St. Andrews. "There is one reward which will not fail you, and which may be called disinterested, because it is not a consequence, but is inherent in the very fact of deserving it. The deeper and more varied interest you will feel in life, which will give it tenfold its value, and a value which will last to the end. All merely personal objects, like a career, grow less valuable as we advance in life. This not only endures, but increases." So this is Mill about the self-rewarding aspect of education. And I quote now from Newman, "I am asked, what is the end of university education and of the liberal or philosophical knowledge which I conceive it to impart? I answer that it has a very tangible, real, and sufficient end, though the end cannot be divided from that knowledge itself. Knowledge is capable of being its own end. Such is the constitution of the human mind that any kind of knowledge, if it be really such, is its own reward. Both authors find knowledge to be self-rewarding if it is philosophical rather than professional. Neither the social utility nor the just distribution of this internal reward appear to be considered. However, to say of something that it is its own end, an end pursued for its own sake, is not yet to say what that sake is. That is to say, what place it occupies in life or in society or among our broader schemes of value. By way of an analogy, we say that happiness or pleasure are pursued for their own end, for their own sake. not for the sake of some further good. They have an intrinsic or inherent value. But that Aristotelian distinction, namely between intrinsic and instrumental goods, does not give us a full account of the matter. For another question is, what place do happiness or pleasure have in our overall system of values and goods, including the whole variety of similarly intrinsic goods? Aristotle held that there must be some intrinsic good to serve as the ultimate end of all our pursuits, otherwise the whole system of ends would fail its purpose of justifying or rationalizing purposive behavior. Be that as it may, it still does not follow from the intrinsic status of a good, such as pleasure or happiness, that it is also ultimate in the sense of governing all of our purposive behavior. Indeed, nothing follows from it about the role or the place of that value in life and society. We may thus pursue happiness for its own sake, not for the sake of some ulterior purpose, and yet be quite willing to sacrifice our happiness for the sake of some higher value. Similarly, to say that knowledge is intrinsically valuable is not yet to say that its value is ultimate in the Aristotelian sense, nor is it to spell out what the place of knowledge is, even as an intrinsic value, and how it might be integrated into the larger scheme. The formula for its own sake doesn't tell us how to rank the good in question, happiness or knowledge, when questions of justice arise, or in our overall evaluation of the good, where other equally intrinsic values call for our attention. Indeed, both Mill and Newman add more substantive accounts regarding the inherent value of knowledge and education. They don't leave it at knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Newman, something I've already quoted, but I want to focus in, such is the constitution of the human mind, that any kind of knowledge, if it be really such, is its own reward. Thus, the fact that knowledge is of intrinsic value to us shows something of moral significance. It shows that the human mind is not governed merely by the particularities of animal life, or merely by material need, and that its sources of motivation, that is to say, what such a mind finds valuable in its own right, include an appreciation of universal truths. That the human mind is so constituted is a sign, or perhaps a constituent, of its freedom. Primarily the freedom from the causal constraints of material nature. Human beings are freer than other natural creatures in being responsive to the universal over and above the particular, and in being capable of acting on this responsiveness. The distinction between the constrained and the liberal is superimposed here on that between the instrumental and the intrinsic, suggesting thereby that the intrinsic value of knowledge liberates by releasing us from the control of the particular and the material, releasing us to a rational order. I quote now from Mill on the same point. The moral and religious influence which a university can exercise consists less in any express teaching than in the pervading tone of the place. Whatever it teaches, it should teach as penetrated by a sense of duty. It should present all knowledge as a means to worthiness of life, given for the double purpose of making each of us practically useful to his fellow creatures, and of elevating the character of the species itself, exalting and dignifying our nature. So it's not so much that knowledge is its own end, as it is a means to a moral end, namely the worthiness of life. It consists in the exalting and dignifying pursuit, penetrated by a sense of duty, of the most general view of the world, which elevates the species above the natural order. We're not likely to share this anti-naturalist valuation, but we have to see it where it is. Like Newman, Mill sees in the elevation of humanity a moral worthiness, in which the value of knowledge consists. Subordinating the intellectual aspect of knowledge to its moral aspect is still to release it from practical or utilitarian functions, but it is to do so in a way that is richer than the tautological knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Mill does mention being practically useful to fellow creatures, but questions of social utility and just distribution seem very much subordinate to the task of elevating and dignifying human nature as such. And I pointed out, it's interesting, Mill is known as a utilitarian, but here his argument is not at all utilitarian. I move now a little bit to Kant, a very different view regarding both the place of professional education within the academic curriculum and at a deeper level regarding the kind of freedom that is relevant to knowledge and academic affairs. A political rather than an economic freedom is to be found in Kant's book, The Conflict of the Faculties. Kant excludes the professional faculties, in his case theology is included in the professional, law and medicine, not from the university curriculum as such, but only from the full scope of academic freedom, allowing governmental intervention in the teachings of the higher faculties, the theology, law and medicine, whose spheres of interest intersect with public affairs, while insisting on absolute freedom only for the philosophical or lower faculty, which deals with science and truth alone. I quote from Kant, "It is absolutely essential that the learned community at the university also contain a faculty that is independent of the government's command with regard to its teaching. One that having no command to give is free to evaluate everything and concern itself with the interests of the sciences, that is, with truth. One in which reason is authorized to speak out publicly, for without a faculty of this kind, the truth would not come to light, and this would be to the government's own detriment. But reason is by its own nature free and admits of no command to hold something as true, no imperative believe, but only a free I believe." That's Kant from The Conflict of Faculties. Kant differs from Mill and Newman in a number of respects. First, while Mill and Newman think primarily of the educational aspect of knowledge in the university curriculum, Kant takes the discovery of truth to be paramount. His is a budding research university, maybe not historically yet, but in idea. Not merely an educational facility. Consequently, Kant does not deny a place to scientifically, or in his case theologically, based professions in university curriculum, and he does not see their economic utility as grounds for exclusion from university teaching. Secondly, Kant is more aware than the two later thinkers of the potential conflict, indeed actual in his case, between the public and the intellectual dimension of university teaching, and of the ways this conflict, inherent in the very act of institutionalizing universities in social and political framework, can be translated into an internal university conflict of faculties. Thirdly, and that's perhaps the most important point, he advocates institutional freedom, political freedom, because it is conducive to truth. Not merely truth, universal truth, or knowledge, because it is conducive to human freedom in general. In this emphasis, he articulates the need for a specific academic freedom, not just the freedom of mind that university studies cultivate and promote. Reason is inherently free, but Kant makes it clear that academics should also be institutionally and politically free, authorized to express reason in public, else truth shall not come to light. Kant's emphasis on bringing truth to light point to the intrinsic value of knowledge as depending on the free I believe of human reason, but does not exclude its instrumental value as well. This makes it possible for him not to exclude professional knowledge while raising the political issue of academic freedom as a public concern. Both strands of valuing knowledge independently of consequences, valuing truth and valuing education, merge in the Humboldtian ideal of the university as it had been institutionalized since the establishment of the University of Berlin in 1810. The ideas associated with that institution, those of Freiheit, Wissenschaft, and Bildung, incorporate both what Mill and Newman had later seen as the civilizing mission of the university, of university education, the Bildung aspect, and what Kant had earlier than they seen as the coming of truth to light, truth or Wissenschaft. Ideally, all three of these values interlock inseparably. Without Wissenschaft, there would be no Bildung, which is Mill and Newman's point, and without Freiheit, there would be no Wissenschaft, which is Kant's point. In less than ideal conditions, they may come apart. The civilizing mission can be seen as elitism, standing immorally in the way of satisfying urgent needs of society, humanities versus the sciences, for example, while freedom can be viewed as less than necessary in bringing truth to light. The ideals have been tarnished in contemporary realities of research universities and mass tertiary education, but have they been rendered entirely empty? How much time do I have?
Actually, your time is over.
My time is out. So I will leave out the more contemporary thinkers that I discussed here, and I will leave us with this question. The ideals have been indeed tarnished. These ideals of knowledge for its own sake, underlying which is a notion of freedom or freedom of inquiry as the unifying structure of the university. The ideal has been tarnished. Has it been rendered completely empty? I think these ideals have not been rendered empty, but they deserve a more integrative application, incorporating, besides free inquiry and truth, both economic utility in applied science and critical public speech. But I will end here.